Welcome. Today we're going to talk about embracing the power of the MVP. I'm pretty excited to talk about this with some of the people that we have. If you don't know, this is the latest UnConference that we started about 4 years ago. I remember I was sitting on the beach in South Carolina when the world ended in 2020. And I was down there and we had, all of the Sparkboxers had all these talks that we prepared for spring conference season. And I was sitting there and we had just heard that the borders were closing and the world was ending. This is like the next day the airport started closing and I was down in South Carolina for an event. And I remember talking to the person who was doing all of our content at that time, Emily, and she said, "What are we going to do? We have all this content." And I said, "Why don't we put on our own event?" And 6 weeks later, we put on our first unconference, and ever since then, this is what we've been doing: is sharing, what we used to share at a lot of conferences and that kind of stuff with people of the internets and putting on our own events. So I'm really excited you're here. So we'll have a few things for you today. I'm going to kick things off and talk a little bit about setting the stage for MVPs and kind of some things that we've learned along the way. And then we'll actually have some talks from some of the other Sparkboxers here. Leah will be talking about the importance of road mapping. Natalie will do a talk on kitchen sink syndrome. And Catherine will be talking about creating a technical foundation. Then we'll end with a quick panel and we'll take questions from y'all. And the Q&A feature should be open. And if not, we can just use the chat, but I think the Q&A feature is open. Yes, it is. And if you put your questions in there, we'll go through and we'll answer whatever you want to ask us. We love talking about this stuff. So with that, let's get going. So let's start real quick with the idea of MVP. And this is a concept that's been around for a long time, and I've been doing web work for, I think it's almost 25, it's a little over 25 years now, and this is a concept that we've been talking about forever, right? And pretty simple, it's this idea of minimum viable product. And I think these words get us in a little bit of trouble. One of the things that absolutely happens is the word minimum seems to get all the attention. But one of the things that I think I've learned over my career is we really need to focus on the V, the viable part. Otherwise, what are we building? And not only that, but these words have almost taken on a lot of different concepts, and they'll almost drive you nuts. They're so overused. Um, it's so easy to get burned by this, and I can't tell you how many times someone has used these words against the right thing to do, where they've said, "Oh, we're doing this MVP style. We don't have time for that." And I'm like, "What? What are you talking about?" And actually, when I was talking about doing this event and talking about MVPs in general with Leah, our experience design director, she actually made this face. And I remember it. And the face was, "Why?" And she made a comment that said, "I've grown to hate that phrase in my career." And we'll get into a little bit why, but I think we all have baggage with this. And I think I want to rephrase when we talk about MVPs to talk a little bit more about how MVP is more than a deliverable. It's more than what we're building. It's the mindset that allows us to get there. It's that concept and how we approach the problem that I really believe produces that value. So I think we have to start with this: is what is the minimum product that we can build to prove viability? And what does that look like from a process? Now, I've come up with a couple different steps that I think we need to go through on every single project to be able to have that MVP mindset. And then I've got some examples that I'd like to walk through of real projects that Sparkbox has done over our 16 some years, that we took those and what the results were. But I think we got to start with this. We have to start with goals. And I know that every project, everything, everybody's like, "What are your goals? What are your goals?" And I think this is a really, really important part, because we have to get to this part: is what are we trying to learn, right? We have to have a goal to learn something when we have this MVP mindset. We have to be solving the right problem. What are we trying to learn? What are we trying to prove, right? Because this is often an experiment we're running. So we have to try to learn something. If we define that up front, we actually have a chance to get there. And I think when we talk about goals, we cannot mention the difference between attainable goals and aspirational goals. And I think this is a really important part about goal setting in general, is we can't confuse these two ideas. We should be able to label what's an attainable goal. What do we think we should be able to get to versus our aspirational goals? With a lot of the management and leadership I've been able to do over the years, I've really kind of keened in on this is like, hey, let's separate these two ideas out so that we're not disappointed when we don't get to the aspirational things. These are things that might happen. The attainable goals are things that we need to happen. These are the things we're actually going to measure against. Um, just recently, I was rereading one of my favorite books, Atomic Habits, and this quote stood out to me all over again, which was, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So whenever we talk about this kind of stuff, when we put a system in place or a way to approach a project, we really have to focus on the how that goes, right? Goals set the direction, and they become the North Star, and they set where we're going. But if we don't put things in place that keep those things in checks, we'll never reach those goals. Step number two, I think we need to embrace the constraints. I love constraints on projects. I've been lucky enough to be with Sparkbox since the very beginning. And one of the things that, anybody that's worked with me makes any amount of time knows that I actively seek those constraints out. We all know what the basic concept of constraints are on project management, scope, timeline, price, but there could be other ones, right? These are just the examples. And what I really believe is that constraints can set you free. They can actually become something that we can push against. I think constraints are the project manager's best friend. I love them. I look for them. I seek them out. I want to know what those constraints are so I know what's being pushed against. So I know where the priorities are, right? And it actually helps set the direction of how we're going to approach things if we can define them and understand them well, because it means that we know where that rock is that we can't move, right? The third thing we need to do is embrace learning. And this is something very consistent with everything that we do at Sparkbox, but it's this basic idea that we will know more tomorrow than we do today. And if we're on this path of continuous learning with our projects, with our craft, with all of this, and we are focused on that, that means today is always the day that we'll know the least. So we should make decisions in accordance of that fact. We'll know more tomorrow than we knew today, and we'll know more the next day. If we're constantly trying to get better, today we know the least. And I think this sets up one of the things that I think is really, really important. It's actually one of our values at Sparkbox, is this idea of being curious. And I think the best projects that I've ever worked on are projects where we've stayed curious and we've asked questions continuously and re-examined what we thought we knew all the time and approached that over and over and over again. Because the curious mind isn't settled. The curious mind, the curious project manager, the curious designer, the curious developer is always questioning what they think they know and trying to get better. And the fourth thing that we absolutely have to do to have this MVP mindset is to stay user-centered. If the user isn't centered, well, what are we actually doing? How can we learn anything if we're not prioritizing them? I think it's really easy in these projects, especially as we're a third-party company, is to say like, what are the business needs and all of that. And I think you got to be really careful, depending on the context, because you can add a lot of features that are quote business needs that don't actually prioritize the user, and that's almost always what we're testing, right? We know what the business needs are, we know what those pieces are almost always, but we need to focus on the user because MVP thinking and projects doesn't mean less UX or planning. Most of the time, it actually means more, right? We all know that the earlier in our process of building things that we learn something, the cheaper it is. And so many times throughout my career, I've seen this thing of like, well, we're going to do this MVP style. There goes user testing, there goes UX thinking, there goes user-centered design, all those things go out the window. We're just going to build a thing and see what happens. And it's like, oh, you're going to cut out all of the thinking steps? Why would we? And, this reminds me of one of my favorite development quotes all the time, right? Of all time, which is this by Abraham Lincoln, right? Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first four sharpening the axe. Let's get ready and prepare ourselves to understand what problems need to be solved and make sure we're absolutely ready to make the most efficient use of the bulk of the effort. Oop, knocking things over. Um, so and one of these things that we absolutely have to do is we have to slow down to go fast later because you have to plan. You have to stay user centered. And if we don't, we're going to end up with all of the problems that we always end up with. And this is so key to making sure that we're having that MVP mindset to make sure that we're chasing that viability and we're defining what that is up front. And the last thing about staying user centered, I think we need to identify the sticking points. What makes or breaks a project? Recently, we were working on defining a process for a new project that was working with the consumer market, and they had lots of things they needed. And we identified that the biggest sticking point and the biggest thing to learn was going to be getting consumers that had just been introduced to a brand to be able to make it through the onboarding process of this new application. And we put all of our attention and all of our focus on that piece of it. And I remember the client said, well, what about the product and this thing over here? And I said, it doesn't matter unless we get people through that onboarding process. Let's put the dollars and the investment on the thing that we're not sure of yet. We know we can do this piece. We're good at this. Let's focus on the thing that we don't know that we need to solve. So just real quick, I'm going to talk real quick about how we think about our process in general for all projects, because you're going to need this context here in a little bit when I go through these examples. Um, the first step that we do with almost every single project is this step of onboarding. And during onboarding, we are defining the problem. We are doing discovery type activities, almost always user interviews, and really making sure that we have the plan in place that allows us to move forward. Now, this is not waterfall. I want to be real careful when I say plan in place. I'm not saying that we're planning everything out because we're embracing the fact that we'll know more tomorrow than we do today. We want, though, really strongly held really strong ideas, loosely held, right? We want to stay curious, but we want a really opinionated way that we're going to move into the next phase, right? And the next phase is that iteration, is we're going to build things over time, right? And we're going to continuously learn and build and deliver and continue to do that. Now, this iteration phase can last, for us as a company, anywhere from we've had iteration phases go a couple months. We've had iteration phases last years with some clients that we just never finish iterating with because they're continuously making improvements. And that last phase that we talk about is offboarding, right? We want to be really intentional to make sure that we leave clients and projects better off than we found them. So that's a really intentional step to make sure that, if they're no longer going to work with us on this, or we're no longer directly involved with this project, that we've set them up for success. So that could be training, that could be documentation, or further documentation, or whatever that other steps may be. That is kind of how we end things. So we go from onboarding we define the problem, we work on the problem, and then we hand that solution off to our client partners is often how our projects go in a very general sense. So I'd like to walk through a couple examples that highlight a couple different lessons using this framework. And I have left client names off this, but these are all real projects. Give me a little bit of ability to kind of talk in general about some of these because there is some hard lessons that we've learned about some of these things over the years, right? The first off, I'm going to start with a startup project, and this is kind of this context. I'm going to set it up like this. The budget was about $100,000. The project is we had to name the company, we had to develop the brand, we had to build the MVP product and help get this thing life, right? And the industry, financial tech is what I'll call this one. And for each of these, I also have a quote from the client partner. And this particular client came in, did not have a business at all, had an idea and a budget. And I remember sitting in the onboarding meetings, and this individual said, I think this can be a business. I have this idea. And it was like, okay, Sure, we don't know, right? Like one of the things I've learned from doing software for 25 years is I'm really good at building software. Um, that's the thing that we're good at. We're really good at building software, designing the user experience, the maintaining of those pieces. I am not an expert at picking businesses. Um, just not. If I could, I'd be in a different line of work. But I'm in the work of building these things. So I remember sitting there thinking, right, where do we focus? And this idea of where do we focus and what gets cut is really, really important. We had a lot of constraints on this project from a budget perspective. We had to build a name, a brand, and a product for about $100,000. And we needed some money left over to iterate some. So I remember talking with the client, and this individual was like, well, the value is obviously in these financial formulas that we're going to do, but we need to do billing and account creation and all these things. And I remember sitting in that room thinking, whoa, 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 whoa. We could easily spend this entire budget figuring out how to do billing, how to do account creation, how to do signups, and all of the other things that we've all done as developers and builders of things a million times. And I was like, no, why do we need billing if we don't have users, if we can't produce the value? So we stripped all of those features out. We took away account creation and we replaced it with a sign up link in an email, and they emailed an account back with a secure password. Of course, we didn't like remove the security piece of this, right? But they did it manually. We took away billing, and I remember the client was like, well, how am I going to charge people for this? I'm like, well, if you get people, you'll have enough money to solve that problem, and we'll absolutely solve it for you. And maybe you send invoices by hand for a month or two while we build out that feature. We can automate it. But if it's worth it, I promise you'll want to do it when it's worth it. But we need to get the core of this right. So we walked through this project and we defined what we were going to build. And we built the absolute minimum scaffolding around this and put all of the money into trying to prove out, and so that his users of this could see the value. One of the things we did is he had these formulas for calculating, investment returns and all this stuff. And I remember I'm like, okay, your homework on this is to give me an Excel sheet for each of these formulas you want to do. And he had a list of 12 of them, I think. And we said, you get three. That's what we're going to do. Pick your best three and build out an Excel sheet that mimics exactly what these answers should be so we can test our solution against it. And he did. And so we iterated through that and did that work. So we did the onboarding to find the problem. We did the iteration work. We were able to deliver this for budget, and that kind of gets the result. And we were able to do all those things. He had a brand, he had a name, domain, had a product, was able to start marketing it and all of that. And what happened next? The business didn't work. He couldn't garner enough attention to make it worth continued investment. And that kind of taught me a really important lesson when we talk about this MVP mindset, which is failure is always an option. And that's not always a bad one. Sometimes limiting future investment is the best case outcome when we're taking this kind of approach. If there was a process that could be taken to always get you results and works every time, then I promise you would have heard about it. I would have heard about it, or I would have written a book, right? If I had the secret to make every single project we work with a success, then I absolutely would have already done it. But that's not the way things work. The second example I want to talk about is what I'm calling the going digital project business case here. And its constraints are completely different. Their budget and time, this is a long time client that we'd worked with on several different cases, but they had $20,000 in 2 weeks. The project was to find new ways to drive efficiency through web technology. This business existed through paper, like paper forms and triplicate, like that would hand off and do things. And they were in the retail energy space. And I remember the client quote that stuck out to me as I'm having this conversation with this client partner, that it has to be fast and easy to use. That's what they needed. And they needed to get rid of these papers. Their target market was the entire state of Ohio. And they had people on the ground all over the state. And to process these new signups, They were actually doing retail, like door to door in events and whatnot. They actually had a system of runners that would pick up the contract in triplicate from here, take one page off, and then run it to here. And they had collection points, and they would all filter back to the middle of Ohio. And they would lose days because if they missed the sign up window for their customer, there could be another month. So there's a huge benefit into being fast and easy to use. So let's go back to our general process here, right? During the onboarding, they were defining like, hey, we have all these papers. We need to support our staff better in the field. Sometimes they're knocking on the same house 2 or 3 times, and we're getting complaints filed against us. And if you know anything about the state of Ohio, there's some pretty interesting soliciting laws. And if you do that, you can actually get your soliciting license revoked and all kinds of other stuff. And they were getting in trouble with some of that. So they gave us 2 weeks. And like I said, this was a client that I had worked with personally for a couple years. And I was like, 2 weeks. All right, let's see what we can do. During the iteration phase, we quickly iterated and built them the beginning of what was basically a website that worked on a Android or iPad app, device that they could take out in the field with them and see where their customers were. It had some really rough mapping technology that we could show them where the mapping was and all of that fun stuff, and they could actually sign people up. So when they signed people up, that contract digitally signed could go directly back and be processed that same day. Um, you know, what ended up happening with the result is this was actually hugely successful for them. We built this thing in 2 weeks. Think of it as a glorified spike, but it was absolutely extremely minimum. We took so many shortcuts, so many things had to be rebuilt in the foundation of this, but we proved this could be done. Their staff could do it, and people were comfortable signing digital contracts. We ran about 2 more weeks after that in the beta mode, and then they were immediately like, yes, please build this out, please go for it, give us the better version. And we worked on this project for about 3 years after that, continuously making updates in that iteration phase and testing new things and seeing how it works. The thing we learned here is trust always matters. And to be able to say to that client, hey, yes, $20,000, 2 weeks, let's see what we can do. There was no promise at all that we would be able to do anything with that money. That might have been money they just spent, but they trusted that process. And one of the things that happened with this particular client is they actually got pretty addicted to this kind of thinking, to this short iterations. And we tried this kind of experimentation and built out all kinds of these little MVPs. Some worked, some didn't, and some became the foundation for their business that eventually got spun off and sold. Pretty cool. But that all started with trust and being able to communicate well and tell our client partners what we're going to do. Third example is, let's go to the other extreme. We talked about a startup. We talked about a mid-sized company. Let's talk about a Fortune 500 company that if I said the name, you would immediately recognize. And the constraints look completely different for this. Budget and time, let's call it unlimited-ish budget. Is any budget really unlimited? No, but as far as building a first phase of thing, it was pretty darn close. And they wanted something in 6 months. Their timeline was not hard, but they wanted to be able to prove something out, but they didn't really have a budget they needed to stick within. They were in the automotive industry, and they wanted to open a new line of digital business based on learnings from their traditional manufacturing piece of it, right? And I remember sitting and talking with them, and one of the things that stuck out to me was, we have all this data that we've collected, and we want to find a way to leverage it. And they were really invested in some data science and collecting these pieces. And if you've ever had a chance to work with data scientists, I love them. They are fabulous groups to work with. The best data scientists I've ever worked with are the ones that say, we are so good at the data science, but we are not developers. We have ideas on how to put these things together, but not make them scale. And we partnered with them to help figure that piece out, to leverage those data pieces. And that's exactly what we did. We defined some initial pieces up front. We iterated through it. And eventually we offboarded and handed this back to their development team that was able to take it and maintain it and all of that. The result of this particular project was really interesting. And It was that there was additional features that needed to be added and needed to be there that traditional smaller MVPs or that MVP mindset wouldn't have allowed because they couldn't go to market or even demo something that wasn't more thought out based on who they were and their position in the industry. Their ability to not have some of the scaffolding and some of those pieces wasn't there. So we had to think bigger. Um, and the lesson we learned here was context always matters. When you're approaching a startup and what they need to do and what their constraint is, it's going to change from based on what you do, maybe at a Fortune 500, because that context is they have to deliver something that works. They don't have the people or the humans to throw at it. They can't send invoices by hand. They can't do the self-registration or whatever those cases may be, right? They have to have those pieces. My fourth example today, talk a little bit about a design system project. And before say like, that's not a product. I believe that design systems are best served when we think about them like products. They're internal products, but they are absolutely products. They have users. Their users are designers, developers, UX people, product people, other people internally. So I think all those same rules apply. Um, this one that I picked out, and we've done a ton of these kinds of projects over the years, is, they had 3 months, about $130,000, and they were in the higher education space. They're a university that you know. Um, and what they wanted to do, we were working with one of the departments. They wanted to establish the groundwork for a new design system that could be used as a starting point for the rest of the university. They did not have buy-in for the rest of the university. And I remember sitting in that onboarding, and this was the quote: "We want to prove this can work here. We want to prove it can work and inspire the rest of the university to make this something that we all can add to and benefit from. And we're going to take and make this initial investment, but we want to do it smartly. We need to do the piece of it that we can actually get that, right?" So we went through and defined those features, right? And there was pieces that during the onboarding where they needed absolutely. So we built those features, but there was a couple things that were a little outside of their need that they thought other places in the university could use. So we built those out and we went through and we iterated through all of that and defined all of those pieces for them, right? Eventually we did offboard this because they had somebody in the university take it over, which was great. And the result of this is they were able to not at first, but to eventually get other groups start to use what they had built. And this became something that grew inside the university and were able to actually help deliver value for lots of different people. The group that we originally worked with were able to get a whole bunch of value back because of the investment they made, right? Because other groups started, adding to it and, iterating on it and submitting to it, all that fun stuff. So they were actually able to get those reusable pieces back. And this actually led to them recouping most of their investment in that. And I think the big lesson there for me was that this MVP thinking can apply to any project we want it to, right? This MVP thinking isn't just something that applies to a product. I've actually started thinking about MVP, and I'm not trying to change the words here, but I'm gonna is minimum viable project, right? That's how I think about it because I think that's how we approach most things: is what can we do to make sure that it's viable and that we're not, gold plating things. So a couple things that I want to remind us when we're talking about all of this is one, we have to lean into learning. We have to stay curious. We have to not think we have all of the answers up front because I promise we don't. No better than that, right? We want to stay agile. Maybe it's little a instead of big A or however we talk about it, right? We don't want to be too waterfally, but really all of that for me boils down to this idea of not thinking that I have all the answers and that I'm as smart as I'm ever going to be. I hate that idea just as a human to think that this is as smart as I'm ever going to be and I have all the answers and all the context. I think that's a really dangerous place to be. I think we're better off as humans in almost all aspects of our life and just approaching that. No, I can become better tomorrow. I can know more. I can iterate, and then we can make those improvements. The other thing that I want to make sure is when we go back and look at our goals that we do is that we understand the gap versus the gain. And when we look back at our goals, we have to be careful not to measure exactly where we set our goals and where we are. That's the gap versus where we started and where we are. That's the gain. Because one of the things that humans are really, really good at is having that their goals continue to stretch forward as they make advancements, almost making them unattainable and almost making them so they'll never get there. So we have to be careful that we make sure that we're actually recognizing and looking backwards at the gains we've made. There's a whole book about this that Dan Sullivan wrote that's fantastic that I highly encourage everybody to read, The Gap versus the Gain. Because MVP thinking is the beginning of an investment with a goal of proving the value for future investment, right? That's the whole thing. That's why failure is okay, is because we can not have to deal with the sunk costs. Excuse me. So one of the things that I've absolutely learned during all of this is in my 16 years, 25 years in software is I always have to allow for the possibility of what I think I know to be completely wrong. And if I walk through life with that approach, I can be open, I can learn new things, I can stay curious. But I could be wrong about that too. So thank you. I think that's going to set the stage up really well to have, uh, you know, Leah and Natalie and Kat share. And I appreciate everybody's attention.